So I think we'll start. Welcome to the Contemporary Issues Forum. My name is Kim Weichel. I'm co-chair of CIF along with my husband, Carl. We host programs twice a month on Zoom. And our next program, which is our last program of the spring, will be on Sunday, May 15th on Alzheimer's disease and brain health in America. So please keep an eye out in the e-weekly for that program. So we've been so fortunate this year to have Kirsten Loadal as our intern minister, which sadly ends in mid-June. In addition to serving at RRUUC, she is pursuing her Master of Divinity at Union Theological Seminary, and she is the mom of 3 daughters. She also is the founder and CEO Emerita of LIFT, which is a national nonprofit that works to interrupt the cycle of intergenerational poverty. She is a graduate of Yale University and Columbia Business School and holds fellowships at the Aspen Institute, the University of Chicago Institute of Politics, and the Harvard University's Next Gen Human Services Program. So Kirsten and I are going to have a conversation for a while, and then we'll open it up to your questions. So please put your questions and comments in the chat. So welcome, Kirsten. You are a busy lady. We've been really lucky to have you, and we appreciate you making time in your busy schedule to speak today. So I know that you've had an interesting and varied career, which includes 2 decades in nonprofit leadership and now pursuing the ministry. So to begin, why don't you tell us a little bit more about the journey that led you to RRUUC as our intern minister?
Wow, well, thank you. Thank you all. I feel so honored to be a part of this. And while we're not fully back in person together, Kim and I thought it might be special for me to do this from the fireside room. So I am, in fact, here fireside. And we've had a few people just kind of make today a little more hybrid. So secretly, look, there's Reverend Nancy and there's Rita. So we're beginning what maybe in the fall will be a return to this place. But I'm so happy to be here, and it really has been such a wonderful, not quite year yet, but many months of this experience at River Road. In terms of what led me here, I grew up in a very social justice oriented family, and in no small part due to my own childhood experiences being involved in service at church. This was before I was a Unitarian Universalist, but through the kind of experiences that are offered through our RE program here, that a very strong justice nerve was stoked in me. And I ended up taking a gap year before I went to college and worked as an assistant teacher at a Head Start program for predominantly homeless families right at the time that welfare reform was being implemented. And one of the things I was most struck by, because I had gotten into the work inspired by people like Marian Wright Edelman and my own mom, who's a public school teacher, thinking that I wanted to spend my life working in child advocacy. But I was really drawn to the circumstances that the parents, and predominantly the young mothers in our program, were having of often working multiple jobs, trying to find a way to finish school, serving as primary caregiver, primary breadwinner, and in the meanwhile being kind of re-vilified by a resuscitation of welfare queen, stereotyping that kind of surged during the welfare reform debate. And I just thought, gosh, how can we expect for children to be able to find their way out of poverty if we're not sufficiently supporting their parents and rallying all of our support around the family generation and helping to stabilize family systems? And so that's where the seed of what would become LIFT, a national nonprofit that I founded while I was in college and ended up leading for 20 plus years, came, which really was this idea that by deeply investing in the family economic security of parents of young children, we had an opportunity to help lift not 1, but 2 generations at once. And as we know from brain and behavioral science, if we can help change the circumstances of a household in terms of poverty and other risk factors in the earliest years of children's lives, their long-term prospects are very, very different and much more positive. So that was the seed of Lift. But in terms of how did I get from there to here, one of the things that I really experienced in building Lift was beloved community that, in bringing together our members, our volunteers, our board members, even our funders into this diverse community oriented towards human flourishing, something very, very special was happening in that exchange of social capital. And it was really like doing the work of democracy at a micro scale, but on a very concrete daily basis. And I became more and more interested in that. And I also started to see that happening in my congregational life, which was then at All Souls. And starting in about 2007, I had this inkling that ministry and this broader work of beloved community might be in my future. And so it was after I passed the torch at Lift in 2019, after over 20 years of leading it, that this long ago thought that I'd had of perhaps pursuing a seminary education and answering a call to ministry came flooding back towards me. And Union, very specifically as a social justice seminary, was on my mind. And of course, the opportunity to work with Reverend Nancy was one I just couldn't pass up. So that is, in its own way, the story of what led me here, but through it all is the call that resonates above all else is the call to beloved community, whether it's in a secular or a faith context, and seeing where those worlds really come together.
Oh, that's beautiful. Thank you. So you've been at RRUUC since what, September? I'd say around 8 months now.
Mid-August, I started, yeah.
So, maybe share with us some of your candid impressions. Has anything surprised you about the church? What have you learned? What are you taking away when you leave here?
Well, I've had such a wonderful experience. And when Kim and I were talking before this, and Kim said, now you can't just say all the things that are fabulous about RRUUC. So I have all of those thoughts. And I do think this is just such a special place. And as I mentioned, for those of you who were able to watch the service earlier, I did mention this past weekend at the retreat was the first time that I've gotten to spend so much in-person time with the actual humans in the congregation, not mediated by a screen or masks or just short interactions after services. And that was so wonderful. And it does underscore what a unique time this has been for an internship. It's been a rich learning opportunity to literally be making it up as we go on the ministry team in this new but also permanent reality of hybrid ministry. But I also still know that there's so much that I haven't gotten to experience. In terms of just things I've noticed, one thing that's, two thoughts come to mind. One thing that just has been coming up a lot in pastoral care in particular over the course of the last many weeks and months is just how extraordinarily overwhelmed and exhausted people are. And we've been talking about it on the ministry team almost as a kind of soul fatigue. It's a kind of exhaustion that goes deeper than just getting a good night's sleep. And at the same time, this is a very high achieving, high performing, in some ways traditionally type A, committed, responsible community of people. And we have been noticing, in some ways, it's almost like this self-perpetuating cycle of overwhelm, where people are driven to charge so hard and to keep all the work going that was happening before the pandemic, but their bodies and their spirits are struggling to keep up in the same way. And so, we were talking about how might we give people permission to lead their RRUUC lives in a different way that allows them to also take care of themselves. How might we think about things that like what we did at the retreat this last weekend, of the need just to rebuild relationships at the most basic level? Because we're just hearing a lot of people are zoomed out, they're committed out, they're kind of tasked out, but they are searching for meaning and connection. And so that's an observation. And frankly, as someone who I think in my own way is very much fits the RRUUC profile, I feel it too. I feel that I am trying to do life the way I've always done it. And bumping up against the limits of my own exhaustion and resilience and capacity in different ways. So I'm preaching to myself a little bit here. The other thing I would just say, so for those of you who got to hear Reverend Nancy's kind of State of the Union porch chat at the retreat, questions were asked about the future of congregational life and whether or not membership is growing and whether or not we can kind of sustain what has been a pledge-driven business model in essence. And she very candidly said, no, all the traditional metrics that have fueled congregational life are changing now and not going in an upward direction for us, but it does present an opportunity to, in some ways, conceive of what the next phase of congregational life might be. And I just think the opportunities for that here are at RRUUC are so abundant, in part because, as Reverend Nancy pointed out, of this incredible physical plant and the opportunities we're already seeing happening to build almost even more of an interfaith community center that really you could start seeing taking on a life with RRUUC as the foundational cornerstone, but that River Road itself has the chance to continue to be something much larger in a way that will also bring about, I think, a growth in engagement and membership and funding opportunities. So I feel quite hopeful about the opportunities for River Road in particular to think beyond, again, a pledge-driven, member-driven, more traditional Sunday worship-centered congregational model, which I think is just a challenge. It's one I'm hearing about a lot at Union across all congregations of all stripes. Those are two thoughts.
Well, thank you. I agree with those observations, and it was helpful to hear. So as you mentioned, you're studying at Union Theological Seminary, which is part of Columbia University in New York City. So you've mentioned something about it, but I'm wondering, since it's a commute for you from DC, why did you select Union? And did you look at other seminaries? And specifically, did you look at any UU specific seminaries?
Got it. Well, yeah. It's a great question. Yes, I've gotten many, many questions from people saying, wait, so you live here, but you go to school in New York? How does that work? So when I decided that I wanted to go to seminary, it was very much tied up in wanting to go to Union, which has a proud history as, an interdenominational and ecumenical seminary focused on social justice that really, though, in the last 2 decades has refashioned itself to be very much interfaith. So the fastest growing parts of Union are not the Christian ministry lines. In fact, it's the Thich Nhat Hanh program for engaged Buddhism that is the fastest growing part of Union. There's also a Muslim leadership program. There are more and more people who come into that space identifying as spiritual but not religious, or multiple belongers, but who want to come together to ask these big questions of meaning in an integrated and rigorous context. And Union has always seen itself as a place where faith and justice meet. I first learned about Union through work that I was doing with Reverend William Barber, who leads the Resuscitated Poor People's Campaign, which was the final work of Dr. King's life before it was cut horrifically short. And Union has long been kind of an infrastructural backbone of civil rights organizations, including in Dr. King's time, but now is fully the institutional backbone for the Poor People's Campaign, starting in North Carolina and as it's become national. But then also I started in about 2007 when I was learning about Union, reading the work of James Cone, who's considered the founder of Black liberation theology, which started in 1969 in the wake of King's assassination, and which Union really helped to shepherd and grow along with then womanist theology, which was Black women's commentary on Black liberation theology that brought in the intersectional lens of race, gender, and class. And so this was just the kind of place that I felt would be able to meet me where I was in thinking about a new vocabulary that it can be unique to spiritual spaces around social justice and beloved community. I did look at Star King, which offered online offerings. Meadville at the time was exclusively in Chicago, but has become more online since COVID. And I decided that I wanted to be more with, more of a diversity of classmates and faculty than being with all UUs. And at the same time, I did apply and was accepted here to Wesley and to Howard, but decided they were a bit too mainline Christian for me, and I didn't want to be an only or one of very few. So Union was able to meet me in the middle, and it really has been a wonderful fit for me.
It sounds it. So given what you've shared about Union, I'd be curious, I imagine others would be curious, the kinds of discussions and debates going on at Union about like liberal versus liberation theology you mentioned, other kinds of core issues, and especially how do those overlap or intersect with what we're talking about at River Road and within Unitarian Universalism?
Yeah. Well, yes. Well, you named one of, I think, the most heated debates at a place like Union since the advent of Black liberation theology, but which also is a part of the tradition that comes out of Central and South America, is this kind of liberal versus liberation theology debate. And of course, Unitarian Universalism really comes out of American theological liberalism, even if it left Christianity at the turn of the century. And I think a centerpiece of liberation theology is that God is partisan and God makes choices and sides with a particular community of people, and it is those who are most oppressed. And I think one of the knocks often that liberation theologians have on liberal theology is this idea, whether it be universal salvation or this reification of humanity, the idea that humans are all good, the ways in which lots of liberal theologies kind of dropped all the discussion about evil, sin, liturgies of lament and grief doesn't really match up to a society that, as was more obvious than ever post-World War II, really faced tremendous amounts of evil. So it's that's one thing that kind of courses through all of Union. Now, of course, I tend to believe that there's actually a middle ground where liberation and liberal theology meet, and that someone like Dr. King, even though he technically did his work before Black liberation theology was coined as such, really was someone who brought together the best of the liberal tradition in terms of prioritizing reason, historical biblical criticism, believing in the idea of a personal God as opposed to just accepted authority, those types of pieces, but in a very liberatory context. And so I think that's something even Reverend Nancy and I have talked quite a bit about is, and I think for those of you who read her book, one thing she does talk about is, she says, it's called After the Good News. How do we counter maybe what is an overly optimistic strand within progressive theology and Unitarian Universalism that over time has caused us, for instance, to drop a lot of our liturgies of atonement, lament, grief. And here we are 2+ years into a pandemic, racial reckoning, war. We need to make sure that our theology, as it were, or at least our principles, our liturgy, our way of being can accommodate the reality of a hurting world, but that we also see in a very constructive frame. So that's ever at play. I think another thing that comes to mind, because it really ties in with what I've seen here at River Road, is that there is an enormous amount of focus on the climate crisis. And many of my classmates, I see Charlotte Mogeron, I've been spamming her with all of my my stuff from Union on this because the Center for Earth Ethics at Union is very, very active. But there is many of my classmates came in specifically wanting to work on things like climate chaplaincy, climate grief, concepts like pre-traumatic stress disorder that people are very concerned about, young people especially experiencing, thinking about almost how do you think about hospice on a global scale, on literally, kind of an earthly scale. So it's very active. But one thing that I have seen a lot at Union that I think is an opportunity at River Road is there is a deep connection between the work on climate change and the work on racial justice. And I think there is a very natural coming together of the 7th and 8th principle here at River Road. I'm helping to teach a class that's called Trauma and Grace this semester. And during our segment on climate trauma, we invited some Indigenous leaders to speak to us. And one leader is from Nigeria. He's from the Yoruban community in Nigeria. And he shared this extraordinary framework, which was that, the Middle Passage was climate change, right? Any of these massive displacements or forced moves of populations and such, that's climate change, right? And it was just, it kind of blew my mind in terms of the interconnectedness of our earth justice and racial justice work. And I think I look forward to continuing to share some of that with River Road, because I think at Union, it's very naturally integrated. The other thing I would just mention, which is what I kind of said in the Why Union answer, is that interreligious engagement is really the fastest growing part of Union. And I think that there's so much that we can take with us, as kind of the way in which I think Unitarian Universalism in some ways was ahead of its time in really, really trying to think about building a faith tradition that could draw wisdom and insight from many traditions across time and space. I think there is an opportunity actually for Unitarian Universalism to meet a moment where that's what, the bulk of the appetite at a place like Union is from the students there. I also, because of that, we have a whole course that we have to take during our first year on interreligious engagement that focuses a lot on the balance between universalism and particularity, on how it is that more universalized, integrated traditions like Unitarian Universalism are sometimes at risk of appropriation or of a little bit too much of a kind of grab bag approach of we'll take a bit from here and a bit from here, but maybe not deeply knowing the traditions. And so I found that all to be very helpful for me in my own training within Unitarian Universalism. And I think it's helped to bring some good conversations into the ministry team about how we, embrace our big tent tradition and all of the inclusion that comes with it, while also checking ourselves on appropriation or, too thinly delving into some of the traditions we cite. So.
Fascinating. Thank you for sharing that. I'm sure it sparked a number of questions in the audience we can discuss during the question time, but I want to make sure we save time to talk about poverty alleviation, your work in this field, and racial equity, particularly for your decades as CEO of Lyft. I mean, poverty now, of course, is so timely given many people have lost jobs and homes during this pandemic. A lot of people are dealing with poverty. So tell us a little bit more about your work with Lyft, and particularly, were there any effective strategies that you worked on that reduced poverty?
Yeah, thank you for that. I think one of, at the core of Lyft's member service methodology, and we actually very specifically use the term member, not client, just at every layer of the work to show that the people with whom we are privileged to partner as they are working towards their own life goals really are the experts in their own lives, the CEOs in their family system, and that too often human services organizations themselves actually can degrade and demoralize the sense of humanity of those people navigating systems. So one of this core methodology of ours is that our services are really very much member driven. And so the families that we partner with identify their own goals and work together with our coaches. They are matched for long-term supportive coaching over a long period of time to help them achieve their goals. But at every turn, we're very focused on making sure that our member families themselves feel that they are leading their own processes. And it's where we really started to find in our work over time that there is this combination, not just of economic interventions, but also of social and relational supports that families need to sustain their progress and an exit out of poverty, which is incredibly hard fought over the long term. We found that so many of our member parents, again, often disproportionately single mothers, but not exclusively, were very, very isolated in their lives. And in some ways, I mean, literally displaced from their entire family systems because they were living in homeless shelters or because they had to leave domestic, situations of domestic violence. And that part of what we could do was to help wrap them in a social network. And so over time, our services evolved to be involved more, almost you could think of it as even like AA style group support, where families could actually start to build social capital and stronger connections that could then help tether them to their economic progress, help keep them going when they found that job, but the going got tough, they had a community to fall on. We also focused a lot on the, in essence, subjective, how people see themselves in the world and can start to feel more and more like they, again, aren't just a client, a recipient, God forbid, a welfare queen, but that's what our society always says, but someone who is a leader in their community, a leader of their family with great knowledge and a strong sense of self-efficacy. So that was, we would often talk about this magical triangle of the economic, the subjective, and the relational, or in shorthand, we'd often say hope, money, and love. That is really what what everyone needs, and how we should be thinking about holistic, service delivery and program design in an anti-poverty context, but really anywhere. And I think so many of those lessons have actually been underscored during this period of COVID isolation, and so many people across classes and races and geographies experiencing the debilitating impacts of isolation, of depression, of other things like that, and how that is all interconnected with economic welfare. Another thing, so we early on, in the spirit of really trusting our families to make good decisions, about 20 years ago, we started really pioneering in a US context, direct cash transfers to families. This is something that has been broadly used in international poverty alleviation, but I think in part because our country, especially, post-welfare reform, exhibited a kind of allergy to cash assistance. It was not something applied as much here, but we thought, there are so many challenges our families face that literally could be solved by $100, $200 increments of direct cash that could be the difference between a family being homeless, a family with a baby being homeless, and a family being able to stay on track. What if we just gave the cash? What if there were opportunities where, as part of being a member at Lyft, you could access a direct fund to address, whether it's a certification cost in order to get to the next level in your career, or paying a parking ticket that's going to end up landing you in jail, but is the kind of thing that the rest of us get all the time, right? And it's a slap on the wrist. So we really built out this cash transfer model that now played pretty heavily into Andrew Yang's discussion about universal basic income, and a lot of work that places like the Economic Security Project are now doing on the power of cash for families. And during COVID, it was interesting, kind of a day into lockdown, so really March 14th, we started hearing from funders, seeing the scope of what was happening, that they wanted to actually have a mechanism to get cash straight to families without intermediation, or just with the right amount of intermediation, but without overhead. And many funders came to Lyft because we had the distribution in place, systems in place to get dollars directly to families. So we felt that we were able to meet that moment, but it wasn't without a lot of resistance in the prior years to, the fear people had around cash. So, social capital formation, trusting families to make their own decisions and empowering them through the confidence of things like offering direct cash support, a highly relational model that stays with families over the long term. Those are some of, I think, the key insights from LIFT. The other is, as I've talked about in shorthand, is kind of this dual generation or intergenerational model, which is to say so much of our social services system looks at families in a totally siloed way, as if generations aren't fully interconnected, and looks at issues in a totally siloed way, as if our education status doesn't impact our working status, or that childcare doesn't connect with whether or not we're able to work. And so we've tried to take this very holistic approach at LIFT over time. And our work is continuing to grow, but the need is great. The CARES Act, the latest numbers are that the CARES Act support for poor families probably kept about 12 million families from falling into poverty, though about 15 million families were not able to qualify for it because of immigration status. But that funding has not been renewed. And so we're now in a situation too where that very, very vital federal and support that was effective has been pulled back, sadly, but we're still fighting also in our advocacy efforts for sustained CARES Act support as the long-term impacts of the pandemic most centrally hit poor and low-income families.
The need is certainly great. There was a survey that said, I guess the average family in the US doesn't even have $400 to pay for an emergency. So It shows how close to the edge and how important some of these cash transfers can be. So I have one last question I'd like to ask you, Kirsten, and then we're going to turn it over to questions from the audience so everyone can be thinking of your question. And that is, you end your internship in mid-June. What happens next? Tell us where you go next.
Well, I keep joking with Reverend Nancy and the team that it's going to be really, really awkward because, I'll end my internship and then I won't be able to stop coming around and everyone will be like, wait, did we say goodbye? Because I now feel very attached to River Road and to this wonderful team. It's such a special place. So, I don't yet know all that's ahead. I have another year in my Master of Divinity program. So it's a 3-year program. As part of that, I'll be writing a thesis as a capstone that I think will bring these parts of my life together. So I'm looking forward to that synthesis opportunity. I'll be working on the kind of separate but related track with the UUA and MFC on ordination. And then really thinking about what happens after I finish my 3rd year. I will say that when I came into pursuing my MDiv and this whole experience, I presumed that I would probably, let's see, are you all getting an echo or?
I just muted.
Okay, great. Okay. So I presumed that I would be able to come into this context again, develop a whole new vocabulary, set of ideas to draw on, universe of colleagues and such to take into leading social justice work akin to what I had done before, but in perhaps more of an interfaith context. Or working within an established civil rights organization that needed some help modernizing. That might still be out there, but I think the thing maybe I've been most surprised by is how much I have loved the experience of parish ministry and of working at the congregational level, and how much it has clarified for me what I loved most about my time leading LIFT, which is the actual work, as I said before, of doing community together. I mean, really figuring out how it is that we as humans in a very engaged way build community. And as far as I can tell at this point, that is the only thing that's going to heal us, is these communities like River Road, even like a LIFT, like others that come together intentionally in a sustained way, ideally across lines that traditionally divide us, and really, thoughtfully consider how it is that we want to live our lives, how it is that we want to be in the world, how it is that we want to support the flourishing of all, including our hurting planet. And then we actually do the work together. So it's just, it's thrown me for a wonderful loop, how much I have loved ministry, and it has me thinking a lot more about it. When I was driving home from the retreat on Sunday, in this just kind of glow of just the beloved community of being together, I thought I could do this as my job and really love it. And it was the first time in such a concrete way I'd felt that. So it's all input to my discernment process. And I will be sure to keep this community posted as things progress. But like I said, you may not be able to shake me so easily. I'll just keep lurking about.
We hope you do. We've loved having you, Kirsten, and I'm glad at RRUUC has been such a good experience for you. You've been a gift to all of us. So thank you for all you've shared. I want to open it up. Loretta is going to put us into gallery view. There are actually no questions in chat, other than somebody asked whether the porch chat was recorded. That was that you mentioned at the retreat. So that I don't have the answer to. Do you?
Unless some individuals took footage on their smartphones, it wasn't. But I'm sure if you're interested in kind of hearing what Reverend Nancy Topline, she'd be happy to share those bullets with you. And actually, it's a good point that we probably should come up with some way to share that out. So thank you for that. I'm going to raise that in the staff meeting this week, since a lot of people were not able to be at the porch chat. And I think really important information was conveyed, even just some updates that people weren't aware of, for instance, about To Be Well Fed having office space here, or Scotland AME being our partner in the bazaar. So it was clear people were hearing some updates for the first time. So we'll try to make sure we can get that out to people.
So 2 questions have just come in, and then we can open up to your live questions as well. So Kirsten, you've been asked, what's your current role at Lyft?
Hi, Heidi.
Yes.
So I am currently hold the title of founder and senior advisor, and my role is really it's true to that. So my wonderful successor, Michelle Roan Collins, who was our Los Angeles executive director for 7 years before assuming the national CEO role, and was someone I was really grooming, although she, fair and square, won the national search against 377 other candidates. But it was kind of an ideal scenario where our internal candidate won the national search. And so she and I connect in a very structured way, at least monthly, to talk about what's going on within the organization, and to make sure that I'm continuing to support her and advise her. I chose not to take a seat on the board or continue in that capacity. I have a lot of concerns about founder transitions and what it really means to actually enable an organization to successfully move beyond its founder. And I think it's very hard, frankly, if the founder is too present. I couldn't conceive of a way that we could be in the boardroom without everyone looking for my body language and looking to see how I responded to things. Mm-hmm. So I've really focused on supporting my successor. And after I left, I took some real space before even re-engaging in my senior advisor role, just to make sure that the organization could fully train its gaze on Michelle and her leadership.
Mm-hmm. Having headed an NGO that working with the founder wasn't entirely easy. So I totally appreciate what you shared. So Dale Hill put in the chat, she has some questions. Dale, if you want to unmute and ask your questions.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry my video doesn't work.
Hi, Dale.
Hi. I also can relate to the issue of transitions from founder-led organizations, from some work I've done as an evaluator and a board member at 2 NGOs. Now, I was curious about gender issues at Lyft. Specifically, you've said most of the members are female head of household, which one would expect. Now, given that most social workers are female, I assume I'm correct. I wonder if there's been any problem with matching up the needy male head of households who might be single parents to the services they need.
Thank you for that question and for pointing it out. And I think, we have been very concerned over time with wanting to make sure that we focus on greater gender equity in our work, and also on how it is that we can engage non-custodial fathers in many cases, or, where actually we might be working with a family, I would say, including in, just demographically, say in a place like LA, that's a majority Latinx population. Often we're actually working together with a husband and wife or a couple, and wanting to make sure that we have, a diverse array of our coaches and of our staff. While I think you're right that the field of social work overall is majority female, we've actually we've been able to be successful at hiring a team that exhibits gender diversity. We also benefit quite a bit from working with MSW programs, Master of Counseling programs, and others, and being a placement site for students who are pursuing their clinical credentialing and such. And one thing we do find, make of this what you will, within social work, is that, as many of you might know, it has tended to be split into two arenas, micro and macro, with macro being more focused on policy and micro more on direct service. And there tend to be more men in the macro concentration and women, or women identifying people in the micro, but everyone actually has to do clinical internships and such. So that's been one way that we have tried to ensure that we have greater gender diversity, Dale. We haven't, over time, I don't think we've struggled with finding good fits for people, but it's a great point that you raise. And I'd actually kind of be curious to get the latest sense of whether those demographics have changed over the course of the pandemic in particular.
Thank you.
So Candace asks, how important was your MBA degree to lift development?
It was me, Jack Leibowitz.
Oh, Jack. Okay, I'm sorry.
No, but I'm on Candace's computer.
Okay.
Jack,
right.
AKA Candace, I love it.
Yes.
It really was like a lifeline. And I was very lucky. So at that time, it was around 2005, Columbia Business School had what is known now non-existent, sadly, Institute for Nonprofit Management that specifically ran an executive MBA program for nonprofit leaders, expecting that many people like myself got into the work because of their mission orientation, but maybe hadn't been trained in how to read a balance sheet or a profit and loss, and could use some of that structure. So I was actually able to be in a tailor-made nonprofit management MBA program with other nonprofit leaders that was largely funded by the Robin Hood Foundation in New York, which is kind of a venture philanthropy foundation. And it was so incredibly helpful. And I will say, actually, my finance classes, I think, were the most helpful. What it didn't do was, I think, quench a certain thirst I had for a different kind of graduate school experience. And that's what I'm getting now. I would say, the MBA was very just kind of on the nose functional for my leadership roles. But I have just, I'm so grateful that I was in this position to return to school for my Master of Divinity, because it has fed other parts of me. I've realized how much I think I wasn't done with my education. My husband has called my experience at Union one of rapturous learning, which I think is pretty darn true. I've become somewhat of an evangelist, I feel like, for that it's never too late to go back to school. And it's actually quite wonderful to be exposed to these ideas with life experience. And I'm re-encountering things I read in high school and college, 25 years ago and such, that I realized I had no idea what that meant, but now I get it. So yes, I'm so grateful for that Columbia program, and also glad that I didn't kind of end my graduate school journey there.
That's great.
And I just want to add that having been in nonprofit management myself and run nonprofits, I absolutely agree how important it is to have business skills. Not all NGO leaders do. And you have to understand things like, impact and how do we work with corporate support, et cetera. So that integration of business skills and NGOs is really important. So I want to ask a question that Charlotte posed. Given Union's focus and your own interfaith work, do you foresee your future staying within the UU denomination?
Great question, Charlotte. The short answer is yes. But I think, as any good UU does, I am constantly wrestling with my dear denominational affiliation. I have joked quite a bit with Reverend Nancy during our weekly theological reflection time. Oh, and forgive me, I'm actually going to move where I can plug my computer, and I'm getting a little notification. But I have, I've joked with her that I sometimes have, mainline Christian FOMO of just, I kind of, there's something that would be so refreshingly clear and straightforward of just, having a denominational home, and that, that was within a single faith tradition. And, so, but that's just not me. It's just not me. There are too many sources of wisdom. There are too many questions I have. So I really believe that Unitarian Universalism is the place that can hold all of it. So yes, Charlotte, with healthy, constant UU consternation, I think I'm a dedicated UU at this point.
So given your love of parish ministry, Pat Wan asks, if you could be a parish minister, what would be the characteristics of your ideal congregation or parish? Your scope of responsibilities?
Ooh.
Oh, it's a great question, Pat. And I think I still have a lot of work to do to figure that out, including, frankly, just to expose myself to more congregations and kind of more ways in which ministry can play out. One of the things that I'm deeply interested in, that you could imagine based on my background, is community ministry, and where it is that congregational life and community life intersect around direct services and advocacy work. And that's actually not a space I've been able to explore as much at River Road as I might have thought, partly just because of pandemic isolation and separation and distancing. And so, for sure, I think an ideal parish for me would have a very vibrant community ministry and social justice ministry component. My home congregation for the last 20 plus years has been All Souls, which of course is in a very different setting geographically and such. I have my moments where I miss that deep inner city feel. I miss the proximity that comes with a congregation that, for all of its challenges, has a homeless encampment on site. I mean, there is just a direct connection there. And at the same time, I'm kind of, bowled over by this space and the idea of true sanctuary, integration with nature, and what a refuge this is, and what a refuge it could be for so many. It's where I'm just thrilled that we are opening our doors to Scotland AME and others. And so, I would love a congregation that exhibited diversity in all ways. I know that's tends to be a real challenge too within Unitarian Universalism, and one that I would be committed to trying to work on. I think too, just one real insight for me has been that team matters. And so Reverend Nancy has candidly shared that most parishes, most congregations are teeny, and in some cases just have one or two people on staff. And so even as relatively small as our staff is here, it is a team. It is a team, and there is this chance to do ministry with a staff team and a lay leadership team. And I think that has been very gratifying for me. And I think that the total isolation of being, maybe the lone person on a small parish staff and such is not as interesting to me as the chance to be part of a larger team. So I'll pause there just to make time for other questions. But thank you for asking.
Pat has another question, but I want to say if anyone would like to ask a question, you can raise your hand. However, most of you don't have your screens on, so I can't see if you raised your hand. So what you can do is go under reactions at the bottom, and there is a raised hand, and the yellow hand will come up. So that will push you to the front of the queue. So let me see Pat's. Okay, if there's time, she's for a second question for me. How would you attract more young participants or members? That's what she's asking. And then we'll go to Marianne.
Oh, great. So I think again, this came up some at the porch chat for those of you who were there, that, I do think a traditional model where the expectation is that, the way you find community is by, after college, you move somewhere, you find a congregation, you get involved, you start pledging, you go every week, that we're seeing less and less of that behavior amongst younger people. But what I don't think that amounts to is a lack of longing for spaces of spiritual exploration and for intentional community in which people can ask the big questions about meaning, belonging, values, ethics, how they want to live their lives. I think that the commitment to weekly Sunday worship as the main or only means of being in spiritual space is one that, we will find to be not exclusively generational in its nature, but I do think it actually leaves out a lot of people who would like to worship in other capacities at other days and times and other formats. I've been kind of pushing the team a lot. I really believe that there is a significant insight meditation sized hole now at River Road since that community went online after 30 years. I mean, it was interesting to me when I started telling friends and others that I was coming here. So many people knew of River Road because of insight meditation. They had been here, they had been to events, they had connected. And I think there's a real opportunity to think about, could we, offer some alternative worship modalities that oriented more around contemplative practice. Even I think we had great response to the drum circle at the retreat, and there were discussions of, could, again, there be some other opportunities around Vespers services, contemplative practice, drumming services, things like that might start to mix up the more kind of, Protestant-y Sunday, sermon-driven way of doing things. One interesting fact is that at All Souls, their Wednesday Vespers services, which they've started, which is contemplative chanting, no sermonizing and such, is by far their youngest service. And I can say that having witnessed it, that it is the demographics are very different now that they've studied them in terms of who's showing up at those Wednesday night services and who shows up on Sunday. But it is kind of all conceived as being within a congregation. So that would be a thought that I have, is that there's some opportunities to reach people through different modalities. Now, that also involves staff capacity, planning, et cetera. So I don't want to discount that. But I think that could start to bring in, more people to a space. another huge asset River Road has is parking. I mean, truly, like people can get here and park. And there are accessibility issues around public transit, but the flip side is it's also accessible in a way that some of the downtown congregations aren't because of parking.
And I just want to add that I think you're really coming up with some excellent ideas. I think a lot of churches are seeing declining membership and thus declining income. I think RRUUC is doing very well, but after the pandemic, people have gotten out of the routine of going to church. And I think churches are going to have to rethink how they do things, how they reach out to others, how they reach out to younger people. So it's really a much bigger issue. And some of the ideas you've suggested are good ones, not just for our church, but for many others. Let's turn to Mary Lou.
I just wanted to ask for some further thoughts on the soul exhaustion. I agree that the retreat was very helpful, and I wonder if the team has given some specific ideas to what could be done to address that and help people, especially our type A's like myself, work on relaxing.
So a couple of things. One is that we have definitely felt that people, at a very basic level, have needed permission to say no, to not do as much as they were doing before, and to kind of be absolved of some of the really guilty feelings about that. And so I think we will keep doing that, but also need to just more broadly continue to communicate that it's okay to, at different seasons in our life, be more and less involved in different ways at RRUUC. But I think people do carry a lot of guilt about that, and it's hard to say no. And I mean, I think there are other ways in which we don't make it easy. I was joking that, there was one service where I closed the joys and concerns, expressing concern for this soul fatigue issue we're hearing so much about, and really wanting to extend care to the congregation. And my very next task on the worship agenda was to beg for volunteers for the bazaar and the retreat. And I was saying, it's kind of this perfect back-to-back example of the challenge we're facing right now. And so, we have our own thoughts to do on how to not send a totally mixed message as a ministry team. We have been trying to think of, where are there ways that we can simplify things too? And I think that is just, even in some aspects of the things as a ministry team we have control over in terms of worship planning and such, how can we make things a little bit easier for people? The other thing, and I know Reverend Amanda, for instance, is doing this with the social justice gathering on May 15th, is just knitting back together the human connection and really saying, this is at the core of what we're doing. If there is only one thing right now beyond maybe attending worship that you can do, commit to a relational engagement at River Road that's meaningful over more of a task-oriented engagement and such. We'll figure out how the work gets done, but make sure that you are holding tight to the relationships, because that's what fuels us. And I think people really do still feel awfully disconnected from each other. And it makes then doing some more of the, necessary, but sometimes more mundane feeling task-oriented work, I think, feel more sapping to people because they're not getting refueled by that sense of human connections. We've thought maybe we need to bring it way back down to really, for instance, centering a social justice gathering, not on flip charts and strategic planning and PowerPoints, but on just being together, remembering who we are and knitting back together the human connections. So those are some thoughts, but we would welcome more, of course.
Yeah, so important. I've talked to Reverend Nancy various times about how we do things. This is important as what we do. And yet when we're so driven to get things done, we've forgotten sometimes the how we do it together part. So it's a great reminder. Well, Kirsten, we're almost at the end of our time. In the next minute or two that we have left, do you have any final comments or reflections you'd like to share?
It really is, just with all sincerity, just to say what a special community it is and how important it is that, you know, people come together like this to build community and make meaning and care for one another, and through that to seek justice in the world. I think that's that's what this whole human endeavor is all about. And I feel restored and renewed in my own hope, being within a community like River Road. There are always things that we can and should do better. You know, it's just not ever going to be possible that we're perfect, but I'm just so impressed with this place. It's such a special, beautiful community. And I cannot thank you all enough for welcoming me in so generously, and hope I have honored that welcome in return. And we'll do everything I can to continue honoring it, because it's a great gift. So thank
Well,
you.
you have indeed, and thank you not only for making time today, but for the enthusiasm and wisdom and experience you bring to this community. We have really enjoyed having you. So thank you, Kirsten, for speaking. Thanks all for participating today. It has been recorded if you would like to hear it again or hear parts of it. So I wish you all an excellent rest of your day. Thank you all.